but what minute that is, okay, clear. So welcome everyone to this week's installment of the Africa Speaks podcast, and today's topic is a very hot issue. It's about the growing anti-immigration sentiment in Europe and the US towards immigrants, and more specifically, towards people of African origin. So just to give you a little bit of context in how the issue has surfaced, I mean, more recently, the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, has instituted an H-1B visa reform, and it requires employers basically to pay 100,000 US dollars to bring foreign workers into the US. So this isn't only a US issue per se, but it is a very obvious symptom of a larger issue that we keep on seeing in the US and more largely in the EU. So I think I'm going to give this opportunity to us, an introductory context into how rising African migration to Europe and US has affected not only the African communities but the US, and what it means to the African continent at large, as we keep seeing educated Africans largely migrating to the Western world.
Is it me or Erisa?
It's Erisa.
Okay.
Oh, thank you, Brooke. I think you didn't mention my name, or I didn't hear you very well, but I mean, this is very interesting. Thank you for the introduction of our discussion topic today, the anti-immigration sentiments and all of the reactions that we are seeing, especially from USA and other European countries. This is a very sensitive issue, so I'll try to make sure that I use my words very carefully, hopefully, as we see how we go. But I mean, you asked a very broad question, but I'll just try to give my own opinions and point of views from both the outside point of view and also from an inside point of view, as you said, like what implication does it have to African communities. So I mean, it is two-way when you look at what is happening, especially in the US, and recently there have been a lot of protests, even confrontations between those who are anti-immigrant and those who are supporting immigration, especially in the UK. We have seen protests throughout the past few weeks, rising tensions. But I mean, it all goes back to the nationalism and all nationalistic sentiments that we see that have really gained ground since Trump took over the US administration, putting America first, and all his foreign policy that he has thrown to, especially the European country. I think you have seen his own statements against these nations here, the ongoing United Nations Assembly that is happening in New York, like saying that all of these European countries, they are going to hell, such as statements that are coming out of him. So I mean, is putting nations first, and I think if I'm to go into the academia as kind of a realist, or these people are believing in putting national interests first, trying to overplay the role of global governance and all the global institutions. But I mean, so going back to immigration, yes, in terms of Africa is losing a huge number of population, be it skilled and unskilled people who are being taken out of Africa. In that case, I think in one of our past episodes, we talked about brain drain, seeing a lot of young people, young talents moving out of Africa, going to these European and other Western countries, including the United States. But again, the rising tensions and, from especially anti-immigrant or the far right or the left wing. I don't know. So Abdul will break down those those technical groupings that we see that are taking stage against and those in favor. It is mixed with a lot of other issues. For instance, some people are talking about racism, especially against people of color. All of those issues are there. But the bottom line for me is, Europe, or be it USA or all these other Western countries, when you look at most of their economic booming is fueled by people from outside. So I don't really understand when I see a lot of rising, because the questions which are being posed, and I think what we see that is happening in the US, all of the sectors or even the fields that we see that have been occupied by these so-called immigrants, there are sectors or there are fields where the local citizens, whom you say that they are not immigrants, though it is also that one is contested, because even these people aren't immigrants. Some of them, they have mixed backgrounds and history. So the real citizens of these nations, they don't want to enter into those sectors, because when you look at the industries, most of the warehouses and other sectors of the economy, they are occupied by these immigrants. So they are doing work which in real sense the local citizens are undermining, or they are not even willing to go into. So in one way or the other, these countries are gaining out of this immigration for them. And on the other hand, Africa is losing both skilled and unskilled laborers, as I said. So, and all of these issues are there. We have to look into them. So for me, really, I don't think that the West or European countries have a lot to gain when they say we are chasing away all the immigrants. But and again also it is two way. They say we are anti-immigrants, illegal immigrants, and then legal immigrants. Those are also two different things. Having someone in your country who has illegally entered, and those who have regularly entered the country. So there are also two confusing terms there that we need also to be clear about. So I mean, it is mixed, but again, from a Pan-Africanist point of view, I also think that it is closely linked to racist ideologies that they have been very central to these European countries, especially against people of color, and also fellow quote unquote white people coming from other different countries, because it is not only against the blacks, but also we see Asians, they are being highly discriminated and they face a lot of racism, especially when they are in Europe or even in the US. So I mean, it is a combination of all of these factors, but again it goes very, very far and beyond when it comes to blacks, because I think historically and endemically we have been central affected by racism, especially when we are outside of the continent. So I will leave it at this point and then allow my other colleagues to weigh in, as I will be coming back to also give out my point of view. Thank you. Over to you, Brooke.
Thank you, Arisa. Thank you for giving us an introductory context. And now I think you've already opened up the discussion from an economic aspect. I think you've stressed how there is a lot of fear, especially for the Western countries, that immigration is targeting their jobs, is targeting their welfare systems. And I think this is a very interesting segue to get Abdul Bari's take from an economic perspective. Do you think immigration does more good than bad? Do you think immigration is a net negative, as many in the US and of course in the European Union say? Do you think Europe is gaining from immigration and Africa is actually losing out from this human flow?
Okay, I think this is until we have maybe an empirical something to test the outcomes. But now whatever we'll be talking about is basically what our senses is telling us. I kind of think that in either way, Europe is winning and Africa, it's like we are the land of out migration. We are the hotspot where people move away. So in a way, from a casual look at things, you see that we are losing, because I was following a local news headline in Ghana. You realize that Ghana's biggest teaching hospital, which is a referral hospital, which is supposed to do all the complicated medical stuff, they've realized that almost all the medical staff and the nurses, they've left the country. And now there's shortage of staff. Just imagine a country that has spent millions of cedis to train personnel for its country. And then all of a sudden, these people have left. So that is to say that this migration stuff is really hurting Africa, is really hurting us. Somebody may argue that, oh, remittances are coming in. You can imagine, let's say the whole African continent receive billions of remittances from whatever. You cannot compare that to the human capital loss. Just imagine the doctors that would have saved the number of lives, the number of children that would have had parents if those doctors were in the country. And then you contrast it with the remittance argument that people always give. So no matter which angle you argue it from, Africa is always losing. Now, the other question is Europe winning? Of course they are. Let me just give you context. Trump recently announced that H-1B visas, they will need to pay $100,000 or whatever. And then there was a strong backlash. I was listening to MSBSC and somebody's like, they realized that somebody from the health system in the US spoke to the administration that, okay, if we say this, we are not going to have doctors for the rural areas, because it's like the American-owned trained doctors doesn't want to go to the rural areas. So it's the foreign nationals who are willing to go to those places. So if you don't let us bring them in, then those people, rural areas, are not going to have doctors. And then the administration is like, okay, then we're going to have a workaround that. So just think about it. You realize that they are gaining from it, although they are trying as much as they can to portray it as something really, really bad. That is just from one context. And we can see this from all other angles, like European countries. The far right always say that immigration is putting in a lot of trouble on their welfare system. What they don't tell you is that they will never give you the numbers. That's one funny thing. They are not going to tell you that immigrants have caused the state this much. I've never heard. They always say that the immigrants are putting pressure, using that qualitative term without giving us the numbers. And that's how people lie. But these people, funny enough, are not going to tell you the number of industries that are resting on the shoulders of immigrants. So in a way, I see that, let me not go deeper into this and let me just scratch the surface. I see that this rise is, in a way, if Africa is able to position itself, will be in a higher possibility to retain our own human capital without the flights we always see. So I think is the net effect I will predict is a win for Africa.
If I may, I think you raised an interesting question, that the economic fears, the fear mongering about illegal welfare usage are all unwarranted. Do you think perhaps, and I'm asking this question specifically to Erisa, that there is an increasing identity anxiety amongst the native population broadly in Europe and more specifically in the US? And do you think this is simply just a cultural or identity anxiety, or is it perhaps predicated on, good old racism?
Yeah, so I think you are asking a very interesting question, which, in my own perspective, to answer it, I have to go back into history and draw it out, especially from an African perspective. If you talk about identity and then you talk about race, you talk about culture, these are very interesting things that we have seen that they have been playing in the interaction, especially in the interaction of Africa with other people from outside the continent. So, but before I comment on that, allow me to add a point on what Abdul said. There is also another context that we always forget. fact that when you look at Europe, US, and all of these other developed nations, their population is now, over age. And when you look at the population of Africa, currently I think around over 30% of the African population is youthful population, and it is projected to be at least I think 50% by 2050. All of the African population is going to be youthful. So when you look at the population pyramids of all of these developed countries, majority of their population is above 50, 60. They are in retirement. So they have that difference in terms of all of these professionals that they need in their sectors. Actually, I was surprised. I will not mention an organization, but there is an organization here in Ghana, international organization, but they have a program which is one of its objective is to ensure that there is a very well streamlined process of ensuring that Ghana can send qualified staffs and workers in different fields, for instance nursing and other professional fields, to their country to work from there. So I was really puzzled when I was interacting with this person when he was telling me that he's working on that project. I was like, oh my god, so what happens to us? What happens to what Abdul has been saying? I was also interacting with one of the people who are working here in the Accra hospital, like the general hospital, the big hospital. Like people, we have a huge ratio when you compare the number of the sick people that we are receiving vis-a-vis the doctors and nurses to attend to them. Abdul has just mentioned this. So it is a reality on the ground. You find that these developed countries, they are attracting a lot of our educated people into their own economy and leaving us with that gap. So we are heavily losing out of this immigration thing, and they are playing it out smartly to ensure that, okay, there are sentiments against illegal immigrants, but now let's ensure that we can take these people legally and they come and support us based on all of those other factors. So that's what I wanted to bring into the discussion, but I think Abdul has mentioned it very well. So going back to your question of identity, culture, and other aspects. So I think it is playing out because currently I think all of us, we're interested in geopolitics and we see what is happening. We can't, refuse the fact that there has been growing tensions, especially between the US and China and all of these other Russia, the former traditional hegemonies, if we are to say, like, we grew up when we know which is the most powerful country in the world is, of course, United States. But now, after realizing that there are other, it's called I will not be into, I don't want to be more technical, the multipolar world, or but I want to bring out the fact that US has realized that she has lost that first position. So we have seen how China has risen up, we have seen how Russia is rising up militarily, economically, and in other aspects. So these sentiments, it goes back to what I mentioned, the nationalistic sentiments that we are seeing that are rising in Europe, in America, and other developed countries. Of course, they go back and based on these, theories of identity, theories of race, and also culture supremacy. We both understand how most of these developed countries, they underplayed our African traditions and culture if you go back to colonial times. And as also I mentioned, the fact that culture, identity, and race, they are kind of historical things. When you look at African history, in our African history and our African culture standards, we didn't have naturalized identities. In fact, when I was studying African history, or some of you would also agree with me, you will find that, in our cultures, people used it to change identities. When you come to East Africa, we have a very unique background that at certain point, you may find that someone belonged to a certain identity, but all of a sudden, if we changed, the environment and maybe went to live into another different community, that person could be adopted and his identity would change, or even their race would change. So they were not naturalized, or they were not permanent, and they were not discriminatory, you know. But all of this naturalization and promotion of certain identity against the other, promoting of certain race against the other, they are theories. People have even written books, to naturalize these aspects, and they were all promoted during the process when they were dividing up and taking over Africa, just to ensure divide and rule, and just disorganizing the population to fight each other. I mean, it is a long history which I don't want to go into. But of course, going to the bottom line, I think this is also strongly behind the fact that some countries, they believe that their cultures, they believe that their race is supposed to be, a bit praised, a bit higher compared to others. And I think it is playing out a great role, especially with the far right movements that are, taking place, especially in Europe and of course even in America. But of course, if you have read history and if you have understood how these countries have been playing out on how to exploit others and discriminate others, there are a lot of those historical things that they have done that we all understand. But of course, they were built on lies. They were built on conspiracy theories which are not existing. So there is that unique aspect, as I have mentioned, in especially African culture. I'm not so sure about other cultures because I studied African history. So, but I believe every society is different and unique in its way. And unfortunately, some of these societies, they want their cultures and ideologies, identities, as you have mentioned, to be a bit above and higher against others, which I think is creating all of this commotion that we are we are seeing that is happening and taking place. So I will leave it at that point to let you weigh in. But yeah, thank you so much for that question. It can't be answered in one conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I also want to weigh in a bit about what the potential ramifications could be, especially when you're looking at the increasing amount of pushback from the Western world. I think the educated that has plans to immigrate and also the ones that have already immigrated and are in Western countries, I think it's about time that, you know, a lot of them do some soul searching, whether you're going to be welcome anymore and whether perhaps, going back and helping your country grow and helping your country become a prosperous, dignified, and respectable nation is the right way to go long term. And yeah, with this in mind, um, I want to zoom in on the potential effects on Africa and, of course, Africans. And I think earlier you've raised a very interesting example of how, with the large number of doctors, for example, in Ghana going to work in the UK, and how that affects the quality of healthcare in Ghana and the potential human capital development in Ghana at large. Yeah, of course, even if some economists argue that remittances from the diaspora tend to set off the loss in skill, brain drain, but there isn't actually a conclusive empirical backed evidence to suggest thereof. So, looking at how there's a lot of increasing pushback, I'm coming to you, Abdul Bari.
Okay.
How do you think, educated Africans that are in the Western world can make the transition back home to be economic change agents? How can they help their countries grow? And how do you think that they can make this transition?
I think it's going to be kind of very difficult because I always say that our governments are not even also interested in making our societies grow. But I think this will be a call on we, the already educated, to call on our governments or to press them to put policies in place to make sure that we grow. In Ghana, you usually hear a statement like, the government is not doing anything. The only thing I can do is to escape the country. Like, people don't want to hold governments accountable. People are like, if government is not doing well, I leave the country. It has become a norm. And that is how people behave. Somebody, you ask a friend, so how do you think about the government? Are you voting? Are you going on a demonstration? Like, what can I do? I'm going to leave the country. And that is how it has been. Now, the rise in the hatred for immigrants in the Western world is quite interesting, because now, as an educated person in the Western world, you know that you are not welcome. So you have only one place to go back to, which is where? Your home. And in your home, you know you cannot escape that to anywhere else. So what are you going to do? You are going to make sure that whoever is responsible for making your home livable is kept on his knees. In which case, I mean, you're going to make sure that the government is accountable. Here, just look at here, for example, the French government is trying to make some reforms, and almost everybody is on street because they don't like it. You go to Ghana, there is a huge menace like Galamsey going on. You're going on a demonstration, and people, they don't care, because they kind of think that I'm going to leave the country. So no matter how they destroy it, I'm going to leave. So if these people, we the educated ones in the Western world, we are not welcome, and then we go back home, we are going to force our government to work better to make sure that we have a good society. And that is, I think that is what I see that we may benefit from this. But another point you look at it from is that the whole world has been built for long that nations must be interdependent. We know that one nation, they say one tree doesn't make a forest. It's the same thing. One nation cannot cater for all humanity's needs. Your population might be lacking something, and then another country may have the solution. So it's good that we interdepend between each other. But what is rising up is showing us that, okay, even though we must interdepend, I must build the capacity to, in a way, solve almost all my problems, and maybe the one that I can't solve, then I'll try to find external solution, and not just relax and let every problem in your society be solved by others. So I kind of think that, like I said earlier, that this, in a way, is going to help Africa, not in the short run. This is in the long run. That is, if the educated people are forced to go back, and then we help our government accountable, we hold the positions. Let me give another example. It nearly escaped me. I think is a very good example. Like, we have most people who leave the country. When they go, they don't come back. So you have the faculties in our universities. I'm not saying the professors there are not the best. They are the best. But that could have been better with some of the people that didn't want to come back. If some of those people outside had come back to join those that are already doing what they are doing, you will see the number of how inventions that we would have. You see the number of good publications, the number of research that has been done to support the continent. But because these people are outside, they don't care. You kind of do the work in which the work that you've been given the funding to do by the Western countries, and that's what you do. But now that this thing is rising up, we're going to go back home, and everybody is going to hold the government accountable, which is going to make sure that we do what is right. So I hope that in the long run, this is going to help Africa. Yeah.
And Erisa, do you have any insights into whether the remigration of educated Africans back to the continent can have the desired economic and human capital development impact?
Yeah, thank you, Brooke. I really have something to say about it. I will just start with one of my recent interaction, which I had with one of the established scholar. I think I don't know if you were there when I was asking. I asked the same question to Chimamanda.
Yeah, I remember.
Adichie Ngozi Chimamanda. Yeah, that has been my question. I mean, you know very well, and I really I will never forget that moment when I asked her that very question. We have, it is a very big problem, like especially of this the educated, the elites. We including myself,
Yeah,
I want
yeah,
to put it clear for our viewers here and those who may listen to this broadcast. We are all based in Paris. Yeah, we have gone to Paris, and if I'm to ask whether we are willing to go back, like after our studies, to our respective countries, it may be a difficult question to answer. As you see, Abdul is already laughing. So I mean, it is really very difficult and challenging, and I think we are part of the problem. So the quickest answer is I think I always say out of 10% educated Africans who get an opportunity to get out of Africa, unfortunately, only one goes back to the continent, which is a very huge loss. You know, it is okay for us, like at a personal level, because we get to exposure, we get the best education, and at the end of the day, we may even be lucky to get employed within these very same countries that we have gone to. So we elevate our lives. But again, as we have been saying throughout this broadcast, that when you look at the remittances, there is no any country in the world that has ever developed with remittances. Remittances are like leftovers. You can't compare leftovers with food that is served on the table. You can eat leftovers to survive, but you cannot eat leftovers to be nutritious, refresh, or even get satisfied. So that is what happens in case of remittances. Remittances, when you look at, I wrote a paper with the Yvette, I think last semester, about it in one of the courses that we are doing about, I think, demography in Africa. And we are looking at remittances, especially within the sub-Saharan African countries. But when you look at our analysis, what we found out, remittances are contributing less to even our country's GDP. So they come in, especially in terms of shocks, because you know, when these people are outside in diaspora, the family calls, you know, we have this kind of emergency, send us something. But the money that is received through remittances has never been invested in developmental projects. So it is something to hope the families immediately when they have a crisis, but not for development, even for the country. So ideally, as we have been saying, we are losing, especially for that. So you can't say that we are contributing to it in any way. So going back to your question, Brooke, which you were asking about it, I wanted to give a context. I also happened to study a lot about how fellow developing countries managed to develop. You know, I always like this example of East Asian countries. When you look at countries like South Korea, when you look at countries like Singapore, all of these East Asian countries, history says in 1960s, 1950s, when most of our African countries were getting independence, we were at the same level of development with these countries in Asia. It is kind of surprising because, like, today when you look at these countries' GDP in comparison with the GDP of African countries, I mean, I'm not a fan of GDP, but let's say in all other aspects of life, when you look at the development socially, economically, and politically of these countries in Asia with countries in Africa, we are not at the same level. But when you go back and read, you will see this. You just make a simple research, even a Google search, and see how countries in Africa were in terms of development compared to countries in, even including China, because that's why even China, according to most of the UN documents, China is considered as a developing country. Simply because in 1950s, 1960s, we were at the same level of development. But what happened? Why is it that African countries, we are still where we were in 1950s and 1960s? So one of the key lessons that I have learned from the books, from scholarly materials, and also from real life, because I have happened to interact with a lot of people from these countries sacrificed. These countries sacrificed to build their countries, something that Africa maybe has in one way or the other lacked. So I think this is something that is lacking, and I think it goes back to the discussion that we are having. We need to sacrifice, especially with the elites who have been exposed, who have got this better education, who have seen how other countries have advanced. But unfortunately, we are not sacrificing. We are opting to go for a softer life for ourselves and sacrifice our countries. We have talked about the number of doctors that are leaving our countries, the number of professional teachers that are leaving our countries to go and teach in Europe, to go and teach in the US, the number of researchers that are based in institutions outside. And Abdullah has mentioned it very well. At the end of the day, it goes back to who gives you the money. The research you will do, it will of course be in favor of that person who is funding you, because you have to oblige by their conditions. So not until we sacrifice and go back to the drawing board, there is always that period. And actually, when you look at the trend, the way how these countries in Asia managed to develop, they sacrificed. They had dictatorial regimes. They had leaders who were selflessly contributing to the development of their nation, leaders who fought corruption, leaders who promoted transparency, leaders who promoted investment in their home countries. But this is still lacking in our African countries. So there is a period of sacrifice that we need to go through. And it is we who have been exposed, who have got the skills, who have got the resources, that have to go back to the continent. I 100% support that. We will not build the continent from the diaspora. No, we will not. I'm totally opposed to that. So we have to call upon our diaspora people not to wait for these, crisis times, because now people have seen, actually they have observed that we are not welcome there. All along the system has been lying to us that you are welcome, but luckily enough, they are opening up now, right from their top leadership, even to the average people whom we say that they are just, promoting these anti-migration policies and discussions and protests when they don't know what they are doing, because at the end of the day, we are the ones who are holding up their economy. But again, this is a blessing in a disguise. It comes at a moment where we need it, but I don't know how it will be implemented, because at the end of the day, things may change when the regime changes. Maybe another president comes and doesn't promote the anti-immigration, policies, and it will go back to normal where Africans and other people from other countries are welcome. But going back to the drawing board, if there is any person there who is passionately wishing Africa well, or any other developing country, we have to go back and sacrifice ourselves. There is no any other person who is going to come from outside to come and say, oh, Ghana, or maybe the administration, look, we are losing our people. We need to bring these policies. We need to improve service. We need to, and it doesn't need to be like we need to. And I think also we need to change the mindset of our people. To build our countries, we don't have to start to begin by looking at the salaries. That's where sacrifice will come in. We have to think beyond, think beyond ourselves, think beyond today, and even think beyond tomorrow. That's when we shall build the future. But otherwise, if we are still thinking in terms of we, about what we are getting, then it means even our future generation to come, they will continue to run out from the continent, because there will be nothing there for them to, to hold them back. That's my opinion. Thank you, bro.
Okay, well put, Arisa. Yeah, I do share the sentiment that a lot of fault is with the educated elites that's abroad, including us. To be honest, I mean, traditionally, everyone is very quick to blame the government. It's an inability to keep the use. But what is quite often paradoxical is the educated elite is abroad, and the government doesn't have the luxury of education itself. And often, those who end up in power are those who stay in the country. Those are not the educated elite. And I think there's a lot of soul searching to be done amongst the educated elite, especially those that focus on like criticizing the government while from abroad. Criticism is good, but when you have very little to contribute and very little to show for your education, is in a way very ironic to just blame the government. And I think I'm going to come back to Abdul Bari, and I'm going to touch upon a few interesting points before I give you the opportunity to weigh on this? And do you think that Africa, currently as it stands, is ready to accept its educated diaspora with open hands? Of course, I think in one of our earlier episodes, we also discussed about the ability of the existing economy to absorb the educated diaspora that is coming. But I mean, others would argue that, I mean, there's a lot to be done in the way of entrepreneurship by the educated African diaspora. And often some very famous writers even say, you know, Africa's problem is it's too rich in terms
Yeah.
of resources. That's how they put it. And if the so-called educated elites cannot, you know, muster the strength and the courage and the intellect needed to leverage and exploit the resources to make something out of their country, something out of the continent, what's the use in calling them educated? So to make my question more specific, how do you see Africans going back and applying leverage where they need to make, you know, real meaningful impact?
Brooke, I would like to start by saying that I would like to diverge from your opinion on the fact that the government, we put so much blame on the government. I say that government have the largest of shaping the society how it wants it. Look at countries like Singapore, countries like Malaysia. In Ghana, usually when you go to every class, they always have this comparison that both Ghana and Malaysia gained independence in 1957. Now look at where Malaysia, look at where Ghana is. So what is so unique about Malaysia? Is it that the citizens were up and doing, or was it the case that was ready to put in policies to make sure that the system and the citizens are up and doing? So for me, the onus is on the government. The government must act. I'm not saying that the citizen doesn't have a responsibility, but government must streamline the policies for, you know, citizens are just, I see, we hold the country, but we give government the power to shape how we contribute to the society. So depending on how the government put up the rules, depending on how government makes sure that the institution is going to tell us how to also contribute to the society. And this links back to the question that is African nations ready to receive the educated people? The answer is simply no. I'm not even mentioning.
Well, I have to step in there because I feel like you have avoided a very uncomfortable fact, and that is, you know, government is a collection of people. For all we know, I mean, there was in another parallel universe, you could have been part of the government. And one of the arguments that we're raising is, you know, the educated elite does not have the vision, does not have the resilience to go into government and to make the necessary changes. And the educated elite, as it stands, is expecting a red carpet to be rolled back home so that they can be welcomed with open arms. And I think it's a little bit demanding. I think,
Yeah, bro.
that's how I see it.
I get your point. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I get your point. Like in one, if you want to argue theoretically, you will say that we are all part of the government. But my argument, even as part of the social contract between the government and the people, it is that we know the government, nobody will have the resilience to go into politics because politics is quite complicated. Nobody will go into it. So we know that, and that we have structured our institutions to such a way that government gets to appoint the minister. But we know the people that do the most difficult tasks, which are the directors, the most technical work. So if you are a government and then you walk in and you say that this director must go, then you fire him. And then you put in a party bootlicker in that position. So essentially, you've already spoiled the whole system that we've set up. You get where I'm coming from. So you end up not giving space to the technical people, to the technocrats to work because you have the power. And this is where I say that governments in Africa are not ready for the educated to return. You have a government. Okay, Erisa, you want to chip in? I'm ready for
I
that.
want to chip in just to give you a teasing question, because for me, do we even really have governments in Africa?
Yeah, yes, that's a fair
Because
question.
what is a government in African case? Because I don't know. Is there any government that you can point out that there is a government in Africa? Because for me, what I see in Africa is a mixture of a government operating with the states, and also there is no clear difference between the government and the state, and we don't have any government that is acting in as in the sense of a government. So I think that's also something that we should ask ourselves: is there even any government in any of our African country? Maybe that's also part of the
Yeah,
problem.
I think we need to be very critical before we start blaming the government. Does it even exist? Yeah,
Does
but I
it
think,
exist?
yeah, in a real sense, is there a coherent government which you can expect something out of it? Because, frankly speaking, if you ask me, when I go back home, I'm very happy to breathe the fresh air and to see the sun and go in, because I know damn well I can't expect shit out of the government. Forgive me for my language. And do you think it's really appropriate, as of the educated elite, to expect the government to come up with a coherent set of policy interventions that would make the educated elite interested or attracted to come back to the continent? I think that's a little bit a pipe dream.
Yes. Like I think I've shifted the goalpost of argument to something I can't even answer. Like, do we really have a government? I think this is more of
Don't worry about it. It's just food for thought, I think. Yeah, but like, as an
okay.
educated elite who's abroad, who's in one of the prosperous Western nations, I think going into the government is one way you can contribute to your nation. There are many ways you can contribute to your nation. Like, we use government as an example. There is free private enterprise, however limited it can be depending on the country you're in Africa. There are many ways in which you can contribute. But the bigger question is, like, is even the educated elite interested in contributing? Because I think, as Arisa earlier said, I think it's a matter of prioritizing your own comfort
Yeah, this
at the cost of your country. Even if, like, we are the very few fortunate ones which our country has been fortunate to produce in terms of human capital, and yet we don't bear the weight. Don't we owe it back to the country? Don't we owe it back to the continent in a way? Or will this just be another cycle, vicious cycle, where people get educated, they go out, they just blame, life goes on, we get old, so does the next generation? Why doesn't it stop with us?
the thing is that humans in nature we are self-centered, and this brings us back to an old political question: how do you make citizens connected to their nation? How do we feel that my allegiance, my hard work should be to the nation? And this is what we need to build. If we are able to build this kind of connection, this kind of consciousness in the citizens, you matter the level of suffering, somebody will be willing to stay because he kind of think that I have to work for the nation because this is my country. It's better to suffer in my own land, hoping that my kids are going to enjoy my than going elsewhere. But we don't have that because I see some political theorists, right, that is a symptom of developing countries because we don't feel connected to the nation. Everybody thinks that the nation is for someone. We all feel that the nation is for the president sitting at a government seat. The government also thinks that in 4 years or in how many years he's going to leave, the country is not for him. So it's kind of like the country is being tossed around. Who owns it is not known, and everybody gets to do what he wants. So this So nobody is ready to shoulder the suffering to make sure that the next generation comes to benefit from it. And I don't want to, I want to go back to the same argument we're having. And I want to reiterate that for Africans to be ready to receive the educated, government must do its part. Government must do its part. Because let's take, for example, Brooke, you have a master's in public policy, and nobody denies your intelligence. You've worked for a lot of organizations. But imagine if there is a position in the Ethiopian government whose responsibilities is exactly what you've come to learn or what you have and you've been working for other organizations. Are you 100% sure that the government is going to employ you instead of a minister's relative? And this is where the government responsibility comes in. Because the government is not going to pick you who is competent, you are not also willing, because did I get right? Because government is not willing to pick you, although you are competent, you are not also willing to go back there and work for the government, because you know that even if you go, they are not going to pick you. So it's better for you to search for the opportunity elsewhere and survive, other than going back and not having the opportunity at all to serve. So what I'm saying is that governments are not ready for the education. They must do the needful, which is policy reforms, making sure that we operate on a merit-based system instead of favoritism, instead of things like ethnicity or whatsoever.
Yes, Abdul Bari, I definitely agree with you that, things aren't, so to speak, smooth, but there are even ways in which you can support your country. I mean, you don't have to be someone in office. You can provide advice, you can provide plans, you can do the actual work from wherever you are, from the luxury of your apartment in Paris. You can provide economic advice based on your background, based on your experience, to a particular bureaucrat. And you don't need to be in government to help your country. And my question is there even truly the intention to help, or are we just complaining in a way? Because I feel like you don't need to sit in an office, you don't need political power. I'm asking you, can you put the time in terms of like providing advice? Because I'm sure like someone in the Ghanaian cabinet and even in my context in the Ethiopian government wouldn't hate to have someone educated weigh in on a particular plan when they're undermanned, when they're short staffed. Hmm? Or perhaps let's take a Ghanaian university. They wouldn't hate to have you give lectures to their bachelor degree students. So I think I'll let Erisa weigh in on how the African diaspora abroad can give back in a way, can contribute constructively.
Yeah, just I will in 1 minute, because I think sometimes when I start to speak, I speak a lot. But I just want to let this out, because we are talking a lot about Ghana, not because that Ghana is one of the baddest examples that we can give in Africa. Actually, Ghana is doing well. Ghana is not the worst in Africa. Just that because Abdul he comes from Ghana, I'm also now currently in Ghana. So I mean, we are surrounded by Ghana. That's why we are always referring to Ghana. But I think everything that we say that we are using Ghana's case, it is something that is happening across almost like the same scenarios in almost all of African countries. So that's just the basic example. Yeah. So I mean, we have had a very interesting discussion about the government, and I think your question broke on how the diaspora can contribute and give back to the African community is also very interesting. But I mean, I may also disagree with you on some points that you have raised, because I mean, at the end of the day, like, though we are contesting whether there is a government in Africa, actually, which I am also a strong support. I don't really understand. I don't know. I cannot say that there is a government or there is not. It's something that we need also to investigate. But it goes back, like some of my friend was talking about, like power is good, and also sometimes when it comes to effecting change, we have to ask who is in position to effect this change. I may be in position to contribute to the government that we are talking about in courts, but maybe my advice, I may give a very nice advice from wherever I might be, which is very okay and very possible, but will that advice be taken up by people who are in position to make sure that the advice I give makes change? So that's something that we need to ask ourselves. Sometimes we who are in the development sphere, we always have different stakeholders and actors. Like when you have a problem, for instance, let me say, if you have a problem of waste management in a city, if you have a problem of waste management in a city, there are different actors and stakeholders who must come together to solve that problem. One person cannot solve it. For instance, the city municipality cannot solve the waste management problem itself. You may find that we need another person to bring in maybe this waste collection vehicles, another person to do the drainage and all of the stuff. So it is a cycle. We need different actors. I may be in position to give advice to the government, but also we need the other person who is in position to make sure that that advice is implemented or it is included in the policy. So as long as we have a system or we have institutions where we cannot be 100% sure that if someone gives an advice, that advice is going to be respected and is going to be reflected maybe in the policy that the government has adopted to implement, then it means that even if I sit here and I give my advice, it will be of no use. And I think that's one of the main challenges that we are facing in Africa. Abdul has talked about it very well. Like, you may really have a very nice qualified candidate who fits into a certain position of power and of influence, but at the end of the day, it goes back to who knows who, or whether you belong to a certain minister's child or you were certain minister's daughter to take that position. And I think that's one of the cancers that has affected our African society. So you end up with people in the positions of power holding the power to change the system, but they can't do anything because first of all they are not even qualified, they don't have the skills, but they have the power. And the person who has the skills, who has the technical know-how, unfortunately they are not in position to be in such a positions to influence change. So that is one of the problems that we are having. We have a very educated diaspora, people who are skilled, people who can give advice, people who can draw the plans, but unfortunately they can't change the things on themselves. So it goes back to what I said, that we need each other, and that's I think where we are underperforming. We need to ensure that these institutions are working as how they are supposed to work. And it goes back to the government we have been talking about. So if we really had governments that are established governments, as we understand government, especially from the context of maybe developed countries, but I'm not saying that we need to adopt that. We can still be unique in our own selves. But if we really had functioning governments where people are doing what they are supposed to do, not doing what they want they themselves to do, maybe I may sit somewhere, give the advice, and that advice could be taken up and work, but unfortunately it's not the case. So it is a mixed one where I think we need to go back to the drawing board and ensure that we change things. And unfortunately, I want to link it back to what I said, that if at all we need to see things working, we need to have a little bit of sacrifice somewhere to come on the ground. Because this is my last point. So, like, going back to the government discussion that we have been having, if you see that someone is requesting a bribery, if there is no person there to contest it, no other person is going to contest it. And I think that's one aspect that we are lacking. I wanted also to draw up on the example that we have seen happening in Nepal. The recent uprising in Nepal that have hosted out to the government. The protests have been led by students. They came out. So to see such a fundamental changes, we need people to come on the streets. We need people to come out and contest. But unfortunately, what happens here, if someone asks for me a bribe and I'm in a position to pay, I'll just pay and let life moves on. And people will just observe these injustices and all of these, misconducts without taking action. And not until we take action, otherwise nothing will change. We shall live, die, and go, and things will continue like that. Our future generations will inherit the same system. Thank you.
Thank you for that, long monologue, Erisa. And I think to wrap up our discussion, I think I'll give Abdul Bari a few moments to reflect whether the coming years, especially for young Africans generally, because as we speak now, most of the population growth in the world is largely coming from Africa. Even when you look at China, when you look at other countries like India, their growth rate seems to have stabilized, and it's only Africa that's growing. And even as Africa grows, it's not growing at an increasing rate, but rather at a decreasing rate. And it's expected that even the high population growth of Africa is supposed to subside in the next 15 to 20 years. But make no mistake, I mean, there's going to be a huge demographic boom because Africa has a lot of population, and I think most recently, if I'm not mistaken, I've heard the president of the European Central Bank talking about how they can prop up their falling demography by attracting educated Africans. It was Christina Lagarde, the ex-IMF director, managing director, and she made a very controversial speech that the way Europe manages its demographic decline is by headhunting and attracting educated Africans to come to Europe. And when I hear things like that, and when I understand the potential ramifications that they may have long term in terms of keeping the continent mired in poverty, I can have only fear. And do you see this continued immigration creating fear for the African continent, or perhaps opportunity?
Ooh. We as a continent, we are blessed with people, but people are just like, how will I put it? It's like a land. If you don't cultivate it, you are not going to get anything out of it. So time has shown us that we have currently we have the most active population, young population, and just like you said, the projections are that we're going to have even better coming the next decades. So it's time for us to stand up, invest in human capital. There's no doubt about it. We must make sure that the best of our students stays in the country. However we do it, the government must work hard on that. And I think that's what I have to say for now. I don't know anything because I'm just ending because I'm going to come back hammering that the government is not doing well. The government is not doing well. And I've said it quite a lot of times. I remember there's this activist in Ghana. He wrote that he's asking those who are now going on retirement, like those who are now 55 or 50, he's asking them 30 years ago, what were your goals for Ghana? And there's this professor who came to write a long reply. He said that when he graduated, when he had his PhD, he thought that he was coming to work for a country that at the time he will be going on retirement, he will have the hope that his contribution has changed something. And the nation has changed to an extent that his kids or the generation before him will benefit. But here he is today, he's going on retirement. And the country is still like it is 30 years ago. So we need to buckle up and work harder. Else we are going to be funding these developing countries. They are going to this is how it works. These people, because they want to work harder for their economies, their fertility rate is low. People don't give birth a lot so that they can work a lot of hours for the country. Then we that is investing a lot of time into raising young kids. And you know how maternal care and other things can be expensive to the country. Look at the vaccines government will have to give to all these people. And now we are able to raise a kid from his mother's belly up until he graduates from university. Just imagine the amount of money government might have spent on such a person. And now he leaves the country. The government who has spent nothing, absolutely zero on this person, and now his productive years is being spent on that country. You can imagine. So it's a huge loss to us. We have to work to stop this. And if governments doesn't put in place policies to hold people back, it's not going to change. In 30 years' time, we're going to come back talking about this same thing. People will still be living in troops to the Western world. So that is what I have to say.
Before we wrap up, do you have anything to add, Arisa?
No, I just have nothing to add on that. I think we have said everything. So for me, I'll just end with one thing. I think I'm more into, the leadership and our governance systems. I think it is high time that our leaders and the so-called government, which we don't know whether they are there or not, they should go back to the drawing boards and recall and emulate things from some of what our founding fathers of our nations dreamt about, especially during the period when we are getting independence. People like Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, people like Thomas Sankara, and many others, freedom fighters. They really had real dreams for the continent. They really fought hard for the continent to get independence. They tried their best to establish governments that were really working for the people, and I think that's what we are still missing in most of our contemporary governments. They are just acting as puppets to these Western and foreign countries, but unfortunately, they are burying our countries deep down, and unfortunately, I think our future and the future of our future generations, they are not so certain of what will happen. I don't know what they will inherit, but they will have exhausted everything. They will fall into the same category. They will end up moving out of the continent, and the continent will stay where it is, or even accelerating even backwards. So we really need to go back to the drawing board, rethink our governments, our governance systems, rethink our political dreams for the continent, ensure that we have people in leadership who are working for the countries themselves, not for their own stomachs. So yeah, that's my conclusion.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for joining us for our fifth installment of the Africa Speaks podcast. I think we'll be meeting next week for another episode, and thank you for joining us.